start and must say it's a great pleasure to introduce Barbara Slavin and to see her book finished. I was present at the inception of the book when she joined us as a public policy scholar at the Wilson Center, and she reminded me that last December, just before going to Iran, I read the final draft and the last chapters in the final draft, and then I disappeared from the radar scene, but I'm glad that the book is out and I'm back. I would like also to welcome the chairman of the board of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Gildenhorn, who has supported the Middle East program all along. Today we are in for a really very special treat. If there is a person very knowledgeable about Iran in this town, it is Barbara, who has made 6 trips to Iran, has met people from different walk of life in Iran, did not just stay in her hotel and summon people to come and talk to her, but traveled in Iran, went to see different type of people. And you will, when you read her book, which is very, in a way, gripping, you get to know how the Iranian society really works and how the Iranian government works. And I thought her title, Bitter Friends, Bosom Enemies, really shows the relation between our 2 countries. And yes, in her subtitle, in our invitation we sent out, she says how the United States and Iran miss strategic opportunities for reconciliation, and we see they continue missing these opportunities. Barbara, as I said, started her new book at the center. She was on leave from USA Today, where she has been a veteran foreign and diplomatic correspondent for the newspaper. She has accompanied 3 Secretary of States on their official travels and reported from numerous countries, in addition to Iran, including North Korea, China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, Syria, Russia, Libya, Israel, and Egypt. Prior to joining USA Today in 1996, she reported for The Economist, the Los Angeles Times, and the New York Times, among other publications. And currently, she's on leave from USA Today, and she is with USIP as the Jennings Randolph Fellow. And we welcome her, and she will speak and answer your questions, and then she will sign the book. Barbara, the floor is yours.
Thank you. There's so many people in this room that I know, so this makes this a little less frightening than it would otherwise be. I want to thank, first of all, the Woodrow Wilson Center, because they really gave me the physical and the intellectual space to write this book, and that was a wonderful summer I spent here. I had a beautiful office overlooking the square, and as Hala knows, I just came in every day and worked, because I knew my time here was limited and it was precious. There are a lot of people here to thank, Mike Van Dusen, of course, so many others who got me the fellowship to come here. But Hala said she was present at the creation. I think she really was. She was the midwife for this book. There's no one who has done more to help me in terms of understanding Iran. From the first time that I went there in 1996, I remember calling Hala to ask her what I would face and what I should wear and who I should see. So she's been tremendous. And because she is back with us now, this really is a joyous occasion. I don't think I could launch this book without her being here. So I've written a few remarks. I'll try not to be too windy. I wanted to focus on missed opportunities. I think that is one theme of the book, although the book also talks about Iran internally, its politics, its constituents, the young people, the Revolutionary Guards, all these other things. But missed opportunities really is the theme. And I thought I'd begin with something I found out last spring when I was just finishing up the book. I talked to some people at the State Department, and everybody seemed to be reading a book by Margaret Macmillan called Nixon and Mao. And it seemed that the word had come down from the 7th floor of the State Department that Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice was hoping for a diplomatic breakthrough with Iran, like the one that Nixon and Kissinger had with China in the 1970s. And as you may recall, Rice had offered in May of 2006 to meet with the Iranians anywhere, anytime, if they would suspend their uranium enrichment program. And last spring, I think there was still some hope, some expectation in Washington that this might happen, that Iran would accept this precondition and come to the table. That hasn't happened, as you all know. Instead, we've seen escalating tensions between the two countries because of the nuclear issue, Iran's behavior in Iraq, and its support for adversaries of the United States and Israel elsewhere in the region. And the chances for a breakthrough right now don't look terribly good. While there's plenty of blame to go around, and certainly a lot of blame on Iran's side, I argue in my book that contradictory and short-sighted policies by the Bush administration undercut a series of opportunities to improve relations between the two countries, particularly in the Bush administration's first term, but also in the second term. I'm not going to go back and rehearse the whole history. Everyone in this room is knowledgeable. You all know about the 1953 coup. You know about the 1979 hostage crisis. Iran has clearly been a very difficult country for the U.S. to deal with for a long time. In my book, I call it the Rodney Dangerfield of nations. Remember the old comedian, he could never get enough respect. And there is a big chip on Iran's shoulder, and that is for sure. Still, Iran had progressed in the last couple of years to a point where it actually was ready to openly talk to the United States. And of course, the tragedy is that once Iran got to that point, the Bush administration was not ready to do it, at least not without preconditions and a lot of demands. I thought just a little bit of history. As I said, I won't go all the way back to 79, but let me start with the first Bush administration, the administration of George Bush, the father. I interviewed Brent Scowcroft for the book, and he told me that Bush 1 was actually quite interested in trying to improve relations with Iran, particularly after the Iranians engineered the release of the last U.S. hostages in Lebanon. You remember Bush said in his inaugural, "Goodwill begets goodwill." And there were emissaries from Iran, various people who would come and tell Scowcroft that Iran was interested in opening a formal dialogue. So Scowcroft told me that he told these people, quote, "We're happy to do it. We could have it official, public, or private citizen to private citizen, any way you want it." He said that the two countries went so far as agreeing to have a formal meeting in Switzerland in 1990. But at the last minute, the Iranians got cold feet. And Scowcroft's conclusion was they simply weren't ready, the regime was too divided, they were still too insecure to open a formal dialogue with the United States. The Clinton administration came in with a different approach, dual containment, harsh sanctions and isolation against both Iraq and Iran. The White House put a total embargo on U.S. trade with Iran and investment in the oil industry in 1995 after then Iranian President Rafsanjani offered a major oil deal to the U.S. company Conoco. Clinton was under a lot of pressure from a newly Republican-led Congress and also from the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. There were already concerns about Iran's possible nuclear program and also about its support for Palestinian groups that were carrying out attacks in Israel. Besides the new U.S. sanctions, Clinton also signed into law the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act, which threatened sanctions against foreign companies that invested in Iran's oil sector. Nevertheless, there was some improvement after the election of Mohammad Khatami in 1997. He came in, he was a reformer, he called for a dialogue of civilizations with the United States, and Clinton eagerly embraced this. I was very lucky to be in Iran in 1998 when American wrestlers went to Iran. They were the first U.S. athletes in Iran since the revolution, and they were cheered, I think, as much or more than Iranians were in Azadi Stadium. And I remember also that the American flag was flying, and it was the first time that I'd seen an American flag flying in Iran without it being burned in an anti-American demonstration. It was very moving. And Clinton followed up on this pinned-down diplomacy by sending Vice President Gore to see then Saudi Crown Prince Abdullah in May of 1998. And the Saudis and Iranians had patched up their relations a bit, and Clinton had a message for Abdullah to give to the Iranians that the U.S. was ready to talk, and they even named 3 Americans who would be on a delegation to meet with the Iranians. Bruce Riedel, who was then the top Middle East advisor on the National Security Council, Tom Pickering, who was then Deputy Secretary of State, and David Welch, who was then a Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of State. Iranians didn't reply. Clinton didn't give up. He sent a letter to Khatami after the Khobar Towers incident, which was a terrorist act. 19 Americans were killed in an air base in Saudi Arabia, and there were indications rather early on that Iran's Revolutionary Guard Corps were implicated in some way. So Clinton sent a letter through the Omanis and the Swiss asking Khatami for cooperation. He did reply this time, but he said that Iran had not been involved in any way, so that didn't go anywhere. Still, the administration continued. There was a slight easing of sanctions on food and medicine and carpets. Madeleine Albright then gave a major speech in March of 2000 where she apologized for the 1953 coup that had reinstalled the Shah, and she also expressed regret that the U.S. had supported Saddam Hussein in the Iran-Iraq war. But she made one mistake, I think a really fatal one, and it's one that the Bush administration has continued to make and has intensified. She distinguished between Khatami and his people, his cabinet, and Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and his appointees. She referred to the latter as, quote, unelected hands. And the Iranians reacted quite negatively to this. As you all know, under the Iranian system, the president is subordinate to the Supreme Leader. That's why he's called the Supreme Leader. And there was no way that Khatami could undertake a major strategic realignment without the full support of the entire Iranian government, certainly without the support of the Supreme Leader. And you don't get support from the Supreme Leader by insulting him, by calling him unelected. I mean, he is actually chosen by a body which is elected, so it wasn't even entirely accurate in terms of what she said. Still, by the end of the Clinton administration, I would argue that relations between the U.S. and Iran were better than at any time in the previous 3 decades. Now we come to Bush 2. It's ironic now to remember that Iranian officials actually wanted Bush to win because they were remembering his father fondly, and they thought that Bush and Dick Cheney, as oil men, would be much more sympathetic to a reconciliation with Iran. They thought Gore was more beholden to pro-Israel groups in the United States and that he would be more resistant somehow to improving relations. Initially, there were a few promising signs from the Iranian point of view. Richard Haas, who was the director of policy planning for Colin Powell and was a veteran of the first Bush administration, tried to limit the extension of the Iran-Libya Sanctions Act to only 2 years instead of the full 5 years. And the administration backed him up on this. But Congress shot it down, and they extended it for the full 5 years. Then came September 11th. Iran, virtually alone among Muslim nations, showed real sympathy for the United States. There were candlelit demonstrations in the streets of Tehran. Khatami came to the United Nations in November of 2001. This was for a delayed meeting of the UN General Assembly. And he let an American diplomat know that he was going to be bringing an unusually large delegation with him, a group that included intelligence and Revolutionary Guard experts on al-Qaeda. And basically the Iranians were suggesting that they would be ready to begin a counterterrorism dialogue with the United States, something enormously important at that time. Khatami also asked permission to visit Ground Zero. He wanted to express his condolences for the victims of 9/11. But the State Department did not push forward on either of these requests. And I think that was the first opportunity right there to begin to sort of change the strategic picture for the United States. That was lost. Still, Iran cooperated with the United States in Afghanistan. It had its own interests in getting rid of the Taliban, which had been a threat to Iranian interests there. Iran played a significant role in overthrowing the Taliban. It had Revolutionary Guard, Quds Force commanders present when Kabul fell in November 2001. And Iran also was very helpful on the diplomatic front in terms of setting up a new government for Afghanistan, supported Karzai. Actually, Iran was the one to put into the document at the Bonn conference that Afghanistan should have a democratic government that respected human rights. You know, how's that for ironic? A senior Iranian diplomat described for me the mentality of the Iranian government at that time, why they were so helpful. He said, quote, "The general impression was that this was a national tragedy for the United States, and success in addressing that tragedy was extremely important for the U.S. public in general and the administration in particular. There wasn't another moment in U.S. history than when there was more of a psychological need for success on the U.S. part. That's why we consciously decided not to qualify our cooperation on Afghanistan or make it contingent upon a change in U.S. policy, believing erroneously that the impact would be of such magnitude that it would automatically have altered the nature of Iran-U.S. relations," unquote. The Iranian cooperation with the U.S. was very popular in Iran. I went to Tehran in December 2001, and I was struck that Iranians from all walks of life, once they found out I was American, would come up to me and express condolences and say how much they admired the United States. And politicians, parliamentarians also went on the record saying that now was the time for the U.S. and Iran to restore relations. And this was unusual. In previous trips, there had been some people who had said that, but it wasn't something that was commonly expressed, and it was in December 2001. What I didn't know at the time, and I only learned of in 2003, is that there actually was some diplomatic movement. The U.S. and Iran had begun secret, high-level talks in Europe. They grew out of negotiations and discussions about Afghanistan, and they had a kind of cover. It would begin with a meeting at UN headquarters in Geneva or at the Paris apartment of Lakhdar Brahimi, who was the UN special envoy for Afghanistan. And then the Americans and the Iranians would adjourn all by themselves to a local hotel, and they would sit in the lobby, or they'd go to a private room and they'd have non-alcoholic drinks and potato chips, and they'd talk about practical issues that were involved first with Afghanistan, but later moving on to Iraq. On the U.S. side, the talks were headed by Ryan Crocker first, now our ambassador in Baghdad, later by Zalmay Khalilzad, who was ambassador in Baghdad and is now our ambassador at the UN. At the time, both were based in Washington. Ryan was at the State Department, and Khalilzad was on the National Security Council. On the Iranian side, there were several senior officials. The final one was Javad Zarif, who, as you all know, became Iran's UN ambassador and is now, unfortunately for all of us and for Iran, back in Tehran. As I said, these were practical talks. They weren't talks about some grand bargain. They covered issues such as how to manage Afghanistan after the fall of the Taliban, what to do about al-Qaeda members fleeing Afghanistan, and later on, what the U.S. should expect after if it overthrew Saddam Hussein. The United States gave the Iranians lists of al-Qaeda al-Qaeda members who were fleeing Afghanistan, and Iran found some of them and extradited some of them, but it held on to some senior al-Qaeda people, including a son of Osama bin Laden. And the Iranians demanded in return that the U.S. turn over leaders of the Mujahideen Halq. This is an Iranian opposition group which was harbored by Saddam Hussein, fought against Iran in the Iran-Iraq War, and has been under U.S. protection in Iraq since 2003, since the overthrow of the regime there. At the same time these talks were proceeding, the Iranians prepared an agenda for negotiations dealing with all the issues between the two countries: nuclear issue, Iran's support for Hezbollah, Palestinian groups. There are a lot of myths about this proposal, so I thought I would puncture a couple of them. First of all, it was an Iranian proposal. It was not a Swiss proposal. It was written by Sadiq Karazi, who was Iran's ambassador in France at the time, nephew of Iran's then foreign minister, Kamal Karazi, and a relative by marriage of Ayatollah Khamenei, of the supreme leader. He got Tim Goldman's help in putting it together and in transmitting it to the United States, but it was an Iranian proposal vetted by the top leadership of the Iranian government. It was also had some input from Javad Zarif, who edited it, and there's the edited version with the last-minute changes are printed in the annex to the book, in case you want to take a look. Another myth is that Tim Goldman, the Swiss ambassador in Iran, who helped transmit this, was formally reprimanded by his government. That is not so. John Bolton, who was then an Undersecretary of State, complained to the Swiss, and Guldeman did get a verbal tongue lashing from Jim LaRocco, who was a Deputy Assistant Secretary of State at the time. LaRocco said, "Why are you bringing this here? You know no one in Washington is interested." The bottom line was this, that the U.S. had declared mission accomplished in Iraq, and it thought it didn't need anybody's help. And there simply was no interest. In my book, I quote Condi Rice as saying that she never even saw the proposal. I find that hard to believe, but that's what she says. In any case, there was no interest in Washington in taking this up. Now, another, in my view, huge opportunity simply missed. I mean, you can imagine if the U.S. and Iran had started to talk at that time, when Iran had no centrifuges spinning in Natanz, when Khatami was still the president of the country, not Ahmadinejad, and the U.S. situation in Iraq, of course, was much more favorable than it is today. Meanwhile, these talks that I spoke about in Europe, they broke off. I feel a little guilty. I wrote about them on the front page of USA Today, and then there were bombings in Saudi Arabia, which the U.S. blamed on Iranian detainees Al-Qaeda detainees in Iran. No proof was ever put forward that these detainees were in any way responsible for the Al-Qaeda attacks in Saudi Arabia. My personal view is that the U.S. used this as an excuse to break off the talks, because the talks had been secret. They were so secret that the Americans were told not to even keep notes. And it's possible that some parts of the Bush administration didn't know these talks were taking place. Of course, once they were written about, it was out there, and so all the neocons could take pot shots at it. And I remember watching Condi Rice on CNN. We were overseas with Pal when my story came out, and she looked so embarrassed that the U.S. had been caught talking to evil, and so they shut them down. So there goes another opportunity. I quote Bruce Riedel, who worked for Bush 1, Clinton, and into Bush 2. Quote him as saying, quote, that the irony was that Clinton pressed so hard to begin a dialogue and got nothing. Bush 43 has had opportunities to talk and even talks themselves, but didn't want them. There were other overtures as well, even after Khatami left office and Ahmadinejad came in. There was a new national security advisor, Ali Larijani, who tried very hard to set up back-channel talks with the U.S. in the winter of 2005-2006. He gave me an interview in which he called Steve Hadley a logical thinker. And he authorized his deputy, a man named Mohammed Javad Jafari, to start up a back-channel dialogue with the U.S. with Hadley, or a designated emissary of Steve Hadley. But the White House didn't reply. So first Larijani, and then Ayatollah Khamenei himself went public in March 2006. They accepted a previous U.S. proposal for talks just on Iraq. This was a U.S. proposal, but Bush administration decided, no, it's not a good time. They were getting prepared to talk to Iran about the nuclear issue, but with preconditions, and they thought to talk about Iraq then would be a distraction. And they also were worried that the Iraqis, I think Khalilzad was very worried that the Sunnis in Iraq in particular would think that the U.S. and Iran were going to form a new government for Iraq over the heads of the Iraqi people. Of course, as it turned out, the Iranians did choose the next Iraqi government. It was the Iranians that kicked out Prime Minister Ibrahim Jafari and got the compromise over Noor al-Maliki, so it really didn't make any difference that the U.S. and Iran weren't talking about it at the time. But the U.S. refusal to accept Larijani and Khamenei's public overture had domestic consequences, which are still being played out today. Humiliated Larijani and Ayatollah Khamenei. It strengthened Ahmadinejad and other Iranian neoconservatives who argued that the Bush administration would never take yes for an answer, and that the best thing Iran could do would be to accelerate its nuclear program and get all the way to bomb capacity as fast as possible, because then the U.S. would treat it with respect and would sit down and negotiate with it. So, here we are. It's not 2003, it's not 2006. We're in a much worse position. Iran, as I said, has accelerated its nuclear program and is perhaps already past the red line. I mean, they know how to make centrifuges and they know how to spin them. Maybe not terribly well, but certainly they're getting there. Iraq is well, the administration may say the surge is succeeding, but it's still certainly a very violent place. Iran has vastly increased its influence there. And the situation in the rest of the region doesn't look too bright either. We have Hezbollah, an Iranian client, doing extremely well in Lebanon, in a position now to be the power broker there. And half of Palestine is under control of another Iranian proxy, Hamas. So for Condi Rice to think of herself as a potential Henry Kissinger seems a bit of a stretch. The policies, the situation is quite different. Nixon and Kissinger had a clear strategic vision of how they wanted to change the geopolitical map, play China off against the Soviet Union, and distract attention from the U.S. debacle in Vietnam. Bush, unfortunately, has been unable to prioritize. He wants to stem nuclear proliferation, but he also wants to promote democracy. And as a result, I think he's had trouble achieving either. He's trying to compensate now by increasing economic pressure on Iran, and the sanctions are having an impact. Although I would argue that Ahmadinejad's own economic mismanagement has had a bigger impact in terms of undermining the Iranian economy despite these incredible oil prices. And Bush, despite this, I mean, the sanctions, the threats of military action haven't stopped Iran's nuclear program at this point. Bush has been forced by domestic opinion to agree to begin to draw down our forces in Iraq, which is only going to give Iran more room for maneuver there. And at the same time that Bush is demanding that Iran behave better in Iraq and suspend the nuclear program, he's still calling for a regime change. He's saying that as you stand for your own liberty, America stands with you. And Dick Cheney said something similar just this past weekend in a speech that he gave. I don't remember Nixon or Kissinger urging China's oppressed millions to rise up against the very regime that the U.S. was courting at that time. Now, obviously there are differences. China wasn't threatening Israel, and China was already a nuclear power when the breakthrough came, and the U.S. didn't try to change that status. But there are similarities. The U.S. is bogged down in another unpopular war and needs outside help to extricate itself. I would argue that the U.S. still faces a much greater threat from suicidal Sunni fundamentalist terrorism than it does from Iran. And as I pointed out, Iran is a major player in all these other conflicts in the region, and I find it difficult to believe that the U.S. is going to be able to bring peace to the Middle East writ large without some sort of accommodation to Iran. Iran's attitude is certainly negative. I was in New York. My last task for USA Today before going to the U.S. Institute of Peace was to run around after Ahmadinejad when he was there for the General Assembly. And I asked one of his top officials, why don't you accept the Rice proposal, suspend uranium enrichment, let the talks begin? Condi says she'll talk to you about anything. And he said, quote, "We think Rice is lying," unquote. Iran simply doesn't believe that this administration wants relations with it. Their view is that Rice is just going through the motions to solidify international opinion against Iran and really doesn't want talks at all. And I'm not sure, frankly, that there's anything that this administration can do to change that impression, short of dropping preconditions for talks and completely changing its language about Iran in a way that I just simply don't foresee. If we're ever going to get there, this administration or the next is going to have to, in my view, accept the Iranian government as a whole, stop trying to pick the parts that it likes, Larijani but not Ahmadinejad, Hatami not Khamenei, and deal with it. I mean, that's the model that has helped improve the lives of millions of Chinese, and I think it's the only thing that might help Iran too. In the meantime, I'm afraid the United States and Iran are going to remain bitter friends and bosom enemies. And so I'll stop there and take your questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. There are some very interesting and new information in the book that we have not read previously, not even in USA Today.
No.
So one more enticement to just read the book. We are going to open the floor to questions. We'll take some questions, and then Barbara will sign some books. Marke, please. And I would like to ask you to just wait for the mic and also identify yourself, please. Thank you.
Well, it's a double pleasure for, I'm sure, all of us to be here to congratulate you on this book, Barbara, but also to say welcome back to Halle, being where we think she belongs. But a lot of questions, of course. I haven't had the chance to read the book yet, but one of them that has always been on my mind is the question of how the Clinton administration approached the idea of opening up to Iran. There seems to have been a serious level of ambivalence. And you can see that in the fact that at least two of their major overtures, the Bruce Rydell mission and the Albright speech, both seem to have contained the seeds of their own destruction. The Albright message, as you said, had that mistake of, that you described. And the message that Bruce Rydell took, as I understood it, included a reference to Khobar Towers and almost a demand that an explanation be provided. What does that tell you about the level of internal ambivalence on the part of Clinton and Albright, or the level of domestic pressure that was being brought to bear? And the second part of the question is, if those messages had not included those mistakes, would it have made a difference with Iran?
Good questions. There were two Rydell missions. The first one was the suggestion that he be part of a delegation to meet with Iran, and that didn't have anything to do with Khobar Towers. The second was this letter that Clinton wrote, which Rydell and Martin Indyk took to the Omani foreign minister, I believe at his country home outside Paris, and to pass on to the Iranians, and that was only about Khobar Towers and urging Khatami to cooperate and to provide some information about that. So those were two. On the Madeleine Albright speech, I don't know all of the mechanics of how that speech was written. I mean, I'm a great fan of Madeleine Albright. I know she's a great advocate for democracy, and obviously there were people who suggested that that the speech could not be too pro-Iranian, that she did have to be critical. I think she could have been critical of the human rights record of the regime and so on without making this distinction about the government. I think that was, in hindsight, a mistake. But the U.S., Clinton administration thought it was being very forward-leaning, given the climate at that time, which was very hostile, Republican-led Congress, APEC, all the rest, so they thought they were doing quite a lot. The problem also was on the Iranian side, and Khatami, who I did get to interview for the book, admits his own regrets that he was not able to take advantage of this. He was constrained. The presidency is a not the most powerful job in Iran, as you know. And with Khatami, he was particularly, I think he had difficulty really putting his foot down. He was, he's a soft-spoken intellectual. Not someone who just, sticks his finger in your eye like Ahmadinejad does. Very different personality. And he had already lost some battles on the domestic front. So he was not in a terribly strong position. The U.S. didn't really begin to make these overtures until 1999-2000, and by then he was already on the defensive domestically. So, they were out of sync. It didn't work. There was good faith from a number of people in the Clinton administration and on the Khatami side, but it just didn't work. And the irony is that, but there was an improvement. There was a warming trend. And had the Bush administration adopted different policies, particularly after 9/11, I think there really was the opportunity there for the first time.
Barbara, would it have made a difference if President Clinton would have written a letter directly to the leader rather than President Khatami, acknowledging basically that he's the ultimate decision maker on foreign policy? Sure.
Yes, I interviewed Martin Indyk about this. He said that there was a difficulty in dealing with people that had blood on their hands, and that especially after Khobar Towers. The sense was somehow that the unsavory bits of the Iranian government were all connected to the leader, not to Khatami. And so that, the decision was made to go to Khatami. But as Hollowell knows, nothing happens unless you address the supreme leader, and her own case is certainly a case in point. He's on top. That's what it is.
I'm curious, how badly did the Iranian react to President of Colombia's attack on Ahmadinejad? There was there a react? I mean, I assume there was a very negative reaction.
I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with that. Was that just something that just happened?
Columbia University.
Oh, Columbia University. I thought the president of Columbia, the country. No. Oh, okay. That was a double-edged sword. There was a lot of outrage in Iran that he was treated so inhospitably. But there were also intellectuals who said, look what happens when you send a booby like Ahmadinejad to a distinguished American university. What can you expect? The man's a disaster. So, it kind of played to both. I mean, my own personal view is that Lee Bollinger could have expressed all the same points without being so insulting, and I think it really was ridiculous, and it played to Ahmadinejad's sense of persecution, which he has, and his the whole martyr complex. So I think it was a big mistake, but I don't know that it's really helped his popularity in Iran. I think Iranians have other things to worry about, primarily the economy.
David?
Dave Ottaway.
Just wait for the mic. He's right behind you. Okay.
I'm curious of your assessment of the internal debate within this Bush administration and Cheney's role, and do you feel he really has tried to block the whole process, or who has, and who's been for it, who's against it? What's been going on inside the?
Well, clearly, under the in the first Bush term, Cheney, his people, Doug Feith, Paul Wolfowitz, John Bolton did everything they could to make sure that the U.S. and Iran didn't get closer together. Colin Powell and his deputy, Rich Armitage, did everything they could to try to keep open channels of communication. I mean, even to the point where, Powell, he claims that the Egyptians did this and that he didn't know, which is, of course, BS. He sat next to Kamal Karazi at a meeting in Sharm el-Sheikh in late 2004, just before he went out of office, just to once again say, to try to get something going there. He was always trying, and he told me that he thought it was a great pity that these talks that went on from 2001 to 2003 in Europe, that they had not been resumed, and that they would have certainly helped in terms of what's happened to the U.S. and Iraq. So they did their best. But I'll give you an example, one particular issue which is very important to the Iranians, the Mujahideen Halq. Now, this is an organization that's on the U.S. terrorism list. It's killed Americans in Tehran in the 1970s, killed a lot of Iranians, and their own people, of course, have been killed en masse by the Iranian government as well. In 2003, the Iranians, asked for the leaders to be extradited to Iran. And in return, they made it very clear that they would extradite senior al-Qaeda figures, Osama bin Laden's son, a guy named Saif al-Adil, a few other senior people that they have on ice, in Tehran. And I was told that Armitage told me that actually Condi Rice argued in favor of a swap. Certainly Powell and Armitage did, but Doug Feith and Paul Wolfowitz argued against it, and wanted to keep them as, to use against the Iranian government when the next regime change operation would begin. I mean, so what is Iran supposed to think about something like that? Why should they, bend over backwards to help us? And you see, in fact, of course, that U.S. fortunes in Iraq began to plummet not soon after this proposal from the Iranians was rejected.
Yes, please.
It was great to hear your talk, Barbara. Marvin Foyer with APAC. Just wanted to ask a question about the 2003 initiative.
Mm-hmm.
On the Iranian side, the initiative clarifies their understanding of the issues that that the United States would want to have dealt with.
Mm-hmm.
In your discussions with folks in Iran, do you have a sense of what their vision was of the outcome of such discussions on the issues that were of concern to the United States?
This was just, as I said, this was an agenda for talks. It was a trial balloon. And it, was shot down. It wasn't even shot down. It just sort of I don't know, the helium ran out and it just dropped finally from indifference on the U.S. side. But there was a mechanism. It lists the U.S. aims, Then it lists the Iranian aims, or rather, sorry, it lists the Iranian aims first and then the U.S. aims, all the various topics and their point of view. And then it has steps of what would be done to sort of operationalize this, that there would be mutual simultaneous statements, and it even has the statement here. Quote, "We have always been ready for direct and authoritative talks in good faith and with the aim of discussing in mutual respect our common interests and our mutual concerns based on merits and objective realities. We've always made it clear that such talks can only be held if genuine progress for a solution of our own concerns can be achieved." This is the statement that they have there. And then they were going to have have these simultaneous statements, and then a first meeting. They were going to set up 3 working groups on disarmament, regional security, and economic cooperation, and have schedule a first meeting probably in Paris, and also agree on a public statement after this first meeting, so that it was all sort of
Beyond the
laid
process,
out.
Though, were they willing, in your judgment, in your discussion with folks, to say cut off aid to Hezbollah at some point in time? I mean, this is a very, very novel proposal.
Sure.
The question is, what was their vision of what would come about?
Yeah, I think they were ready to horse trade. Look, nobody can know because the talks never happened. But, I mean, it was fairly clear, for example, things like, trading Mujahideen Halq for al-Qaeda. It was fairly clear that they had trade-offs in mind. And this was the Hatimi government, which supported the Palestinians, but not in the same ideological way that the regime prior and certainly the administration after have done. I don't know how many times I had Hatimi people say, well, we can't be hotter than the soup. The mouth can't be hotter than the soup, right? And whatever the Palestinians decide, that's fine with us. So, would it have been shot down by differences within the Iranian government? I certainly point that out in my book. It was entirely possible that it never would have gotten anywhere. But I think it would have had a stunning effect to have a public announcement. I think it would have certainly helped Hatimi internally. And I argue in the book that we might never have gotten Ahmadinejad, The whole nature of internal Iranian politics might have changed because it was after this that the Iranian neocons began their march to power and began disqualifying the reformers. It was a little bit like the axis of evil, which was a tough blow for the reformers, but they swallowed it. Look, they call us the Great Satan. Okay, they swallowed it, but this was a practical initiative, and it got nowhere. And it's a shame.
Ferry, did you have a question? Just wait 1 minute for the mic, and then you can pass it across.
Forgive me, by the way, for criticizing APEC, but it's true.
Talk about
the topic today.
Okay. Not directed at anyone personally.
Farah Simon, American University. Thank you so much for writing such an interesting and engaging book. I was very interested reading about the Revolutionary Guards in particular, and my question is, do you think the Bush administration's decision to categorize the Quds faction as terrorist groups would be effective in any way?
Yeah, well, they haven't done it yet. There have been all these stories in the papers that they're going to do it, but they haven't done it. And I think that's because they're thinking about it and trying to decide whether it's really so wise. I don't think it's so smart. I think the U.S. has ample tools at its disposal to increase economic sanctions, to target Revolutionary Guard entities and companies. It's already done that really effectively. To brand the entire Revolutionary Guards as a terrorist organization makes no sense. This is an organization that's full of conscripts. It's completely intertwined with the rest of the Iranian military. And so you'd simply be disrespecting the Iranian people. The Quds Force, I don't know, it'd be like calling our CIA a terrorist organization. I mean, this is the organization that does assassinations abroad. It supports guerrilla groups, provides intelligence. A lot of what it does is not very savory, but it does those things that, frankly, our government also does in some cases. And do you want to call it terrorist? Fine, call it terrorist. I don't know what it gains you. Also, so many of the veterans of the Guards and the Quds Force in particular are senior officials in Iran now. I mean, as General Petraeus pointed out, Kazemi Komi, the Iranian ambassador in Baghdad, is a former Quds Force commander. So what does that mean? Does that mean that Ryan Crocker can't meet with him anymore because he's a terrorist? Well, how does that serve U.S. interests to make those kinds of discussions even more difficult. A couple of the people I quote in my book are Rev Guard veterans, including this guy Mohammed Javad Jafari. I understand he's going to be featured in a Frontline documentary. I'm very interested to watch this tonight because he wouldn't go on the record, and later I got permission for him to go on the record. He's a former Quds Force commander, and he made this big pitch to have meetings with the Americans. And how was he repaid? You remember when the U.S. Arrested five Iranians in Erbil in January 11th? Mohammed Javad Jafari was the head of that delegation, and one of the objectives was to capture him. So, okay, throw him in prison. Interesting way to try to improve relations. It's just, these are the people that we will have to deal with if we're going to make a deal with this Iranian government. We can wait, we can hope and pray that it will be overthrown somehow, but by then they'll probably have the bomb. And to me it seems completely unrealistic to expect that to happen. I say that the Quds Force, they're the people that they know where all the bodies are because they're the ones who buried them. So who else are you going to deal with?
We'll take one last question there. Yes, please.
Thank you, Mark Moore from the Wilson Center. We all know there are three axes of evil. North Korea was the third. They developed, or they had a quasi-successful nuclear test. And the Bush administration is now engaged in diplomatic talks. In your discussions, did the Iranians ever sort of say, well, they developed nuclear weapons and they're talking to them, so this is another reason why we need to develop nuclear weapons?
They didn't bring up, I would ask them about North Korea and Libya, and they'd say, no comparison, we're Persians. The comparison they brought up was India. Because, another great civilization, right next door, that developed nuclear weapons outside the framework of the NPT. And here the U.S. is rushing to embrace them and to sell them nuclear equipment. And so Larijani, in an interview I did with him, spoke repeatedly about India and said, how come they can have it and we can't? We can't even have a peaceful program. And so that's the comparison that they choose to make.
Barbara, one last question. Why was Larijani fired, dismissed, whatever?
Well, I would argue that he was already weakened because the U.S. didn't bite back in 2006 when he was clearly in a stronger position. I think he just got fed up with Ahmadinejad. I didn't speak about him so much in this, but I have a whole chapter about him in the book. Here's somebody who's not supposed to be involved in defense and foreign policy, and all he's done is get involved in defense and foreign policy. He's appalled the Iranian political establishment with the things that he's said. Denying the Holocaust, what does that have to do with modern Iran? It's simply, one almost has to think that he's a neocon plant. This guy, all he does is stick his foot in his mouth, antagonize the rest of the world. You have to ask yourself, would Europe be so eager to put sanctions on Iran if Ahmadinejad had not said the things he said about Israel and the Holocaust? I would argue not. He has enormously helped, and every time he comes to the United States, he hurts the Iranian cause. This last time that he came, he was a little bit more restrained. He actually admitted that that the Holocaust happened and that Hitler was a bad man. So we've seen a little incremental improvement there. But Larijani was fed up. The Russians apparently made some new proposal on the uranium enrichment front. Since I'm no longer a day-to-day reporter, I have to admit I haven't scurried around to try to find out exactly what it was. But Larijani came out and said, Russians had said something and Iran would consider it. And then Ahmadinejad comes out and says, the Russians made no proposal and Iran will not retreat one step on the nuclear front. And I think he just had it. And I think the attitude now is, let this guy, give him more rope, let him hang himself, and come 2009, assuming the U.S. doesn't attack or do anything stupid, Ahmadinejad will not be reelected and somebody with a brain will. So I think we're seeing now that even the ideological conservatives, because Larijani came in as a conservative, not a reformer, have moved, and you see this coalescing now with Rafsanjani and the reformers. They're all against Ahmadinejad, even his former allies. So we have to hope that this trend will continue, and and that Iran will recalibrate, you know, and the key to that is to have the proper external environment for that, which means to calibrate what we do in such a way that it doesn't backfire. Okay, one more question in there.
Barbara, many thanks. And
Can we take one more from this lady here?
the-
Quickly, or there's no
Okay.
time. We're running out of
Just-
time.
Very quick question.
and there was one here too. Then you have to take two
Ah,
quick
okay, well-
questions. Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
Apropos of what you just said in terms of, Ahmadinejad, it's doubtful that he would get reelected unless the U.S. does something stupid like bomb Iran.
Yeah.
Quick question. You're giving this talk here. Are you talking at all to members of Congress who need to hear what you're saying?
Well, it would
Just let's take this question too, and then answer both.
yeah.
Just wait for the mic so we can hear you, and please identify yourself.
My name is Zohre Rastegar, independent media, and I had the pleasure and honor to have Barbara on my show. She has graced the talk show. But anyway, my question is that anywhere in your book you refer to the role of the media and how the policy of this government has influenced the public opinion, regardless of all the faults and shortcomings of Iran or any country. Don't you think that the public opinion is very important, that how much a nation sympathizes with another nation or point of view? And don't you think that the American media overall is faulty about that? I would like to have your opinion, and also if you have any reference in your book about that. Thank you.
On Congress, I actually have been talking to some folks on the Hill, and I'm surprised, frankly, we haven't seen hearings yet with all this saber rattling.
Start in December.
I think there also may be some next month too on the House side, I'm told. But as the media question, I wrote this book because I felt, frankly, that I could not get all of what I needed to get into the American media. Although I think some of these things are reflected, but the media is constrained. In my own case, we have rules about sourcing and whatnot that make it difficult sometimes to quote people unless you could quote them by name, and it's a difficult thing to do. When the administration, for example, says that Iran is arming Shia militias, how do we independently confirm or deny that? It's very difficult, and you can express some skepticism, some doubts here or there, but it is difficult. I would say, though, that I think that the American public is not being swept along this time in the same way that they were before the Iraq War, and I think you do see a lot more questions being asked, and people who feel that to have yet another, invade a third Muslim nation might not be the smartest thing to do at this time. But it's difficult. There's also the question of access. You get a visa to go to Iran for a week. If you're lucky, you get to extend it for 2 weeks. It's difficult to go for many people, and But I would say that the American press does the best that it can. It's not easy, but we try hard.
Barbara, thank you very much. And please do take with you our upcoming events notice. It's on the table. You'll see we are having a series of very interesting talks at the center. Next Monday on the 29th, we are having 3 Palestinians discussing the Palestinian issue. We will have a series of book talk on Iran. So do come back, and Barbara will stay here and sign her books. Thank you very much.